Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Anupa Benny, one of the mentors at Study Medic. So today's topic for Revision Marathon series is behavioral science and social cultural psychiatry. So now these are the topics that we'll be discussing today. It's a lot of basic psychology, social psychology, and about ethics and professionalism in psychiatry. So let's go quickly through these topics. Now, coming to classical conditioning, all of you must have been familiar with this. We have Pavlov's experiment, which explained that when an unconditional stimulus is shown to the dog or any animal or the experimental object, they have an unconditioned response, which is a natural response. This is a natural process. Now, when you want to combine it with an external stimulus, that is a conditioned stimulus, it becomes a conditioned stimulus when the object gets the same response as obtained in the natural way. So when the bell is combined with the food many times, in repeated times, it produces the same response. That is the unconditioned response. When it is involved with the bell, it is called a conditioned response. So this is by learning by association. So you can see the Aramark equation here. Unconditional stimulus gives an unconditioned response. When you combine it with an external stimulus along with the unconditioned stimulus, it becomes and produces the same response. It becomes a conditioned stimuli, and the response becomes a conditioned response. So next, so we should know that once this repetition is over and the object learns these combination, it causes a learning of the new activity. And then later on, when it is not done or the repetition does not occur, it fades away. That's called extinction. But as you again combine it with the unconditioned stimuli, it again regains that knowledge or that pattern. That's called spontaneous recovery. This happens in different ways. So if a similar object is shown along with the conditioned stimulus instead of the same conditioned stimulus. For example, a child is afraid of a rat. The next time you show a rabbit also, it is afraid of it. So round furry objects gives fear. So that's called generalization. But if the child does not get afraid of the rabbit when it was actually afraid of the rat, it is a discrimination has occurred. So it learned to discriminate the rat from the rabbit. And then this is again phobia, which I explained is about in case of Little Albert's experiment. So it was combined with a loud noise. A rat was combined with a loud noise. So already the child is afraid of loud noise. That's a natural response. And the loud noise is a unconditioned stimulus, and the getting afraid is the unconditioned response. When it is combined with a round furry object, it becomes afraid of the round furry object. That is a rat. Okay. Now, systematic desensitization and aversion therapies. These help when you consistently, repeatedly expose these situations. They tend to that fear response tends to reduce. So again, aversion therapy, when the aversive stimuli is combined with this, and it fades off, the unhealthy behavior is removed here. This is called, this is in case of aversion therapy. Okay. So basically, classical conditioning is involuntary reflexive response when it is paired with a stimulus. So the basis of phobia, acquisition, and exposure therapy. Now coming on to operant conditioning. Here, a particular action is required or an instrument is required in order to learn that behavior. So these are shaped by consequences. So now coming on to reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcement and punishment gives a different outcome. Reinforcement is an activity which is done and it helps to increase a particular behavior. Mostly we aim for, obviously, healthy behavior. So this aims on increasing healthy behavior, while punishment aims at reducing an unhealthy behavior. Okay, so now coming on to reinforcement, there are two types, positive and negative. In positive means when the person does a good behavior, you give a reward. It's a positive action here. While in case of negative reinforcement, you remove something which is aversive to the person. So if they don't like vegetables, to eat vegetables. So if you do a good habit, okay, today you can avoid vegetables for now, just because you did this. But again, it helps the patient, it helps the person in some way, that's all. Makes them more comfortable. So next time they tend to observe this behavior. Okay. Now coming on to punishment. Punishment, again, there is positive and negative. Positive is you add an aversive punishment. So maybe in experiments, when the animal does a bad behavior, you give an external stimulus, or like a shock is given. So the next time they will not do it. While in case of negative punishment, they remove the reward. So when they remove the food or water for the time being. So this helps in reducing the unhealthy behavior. So basically, the point is negative reinforcement increases behavior by removing something unpleasant. Okay, it's not a punishment. Now, this is something important points that can be remembered. It can come for your MCQs. So there's a fixed ratio. So based on how you give the reinforcement of the stimuli. So based on how you give the positive reward or you give the negative reward, based on how much you give it and at what particular schedule you give it, at what particular time. So there's a fixed ratio. That is, after a set of number of responses or good behavior is obtained, you give the reward. So that is, here there is high rate is observed here to follow this pattern. And there is a post-reward pause, because how much ever you do, and only at that particular number of, when that particular number of responses are met, you get the reward. So coming on to variable ratio. This is after unpredictable number of responses, you get actions, you get the response. So this is in case of gambling, and it has a high rate of development, because they don't tend to get out of it. They tend to keep aspiring it. So that is, again, it has a highest rate of developing this sort of behavior. So that is, example is gambling. Now coming on to fixed interval. The reward is given at fixed intervals. So after how much ever good response you get or good behavior you do, it doesn't really give your reward at an early phase, only at that particular interval. So like a salary which you get, how much ever good thing you do, you will only get it at the end of the month. So that's an example there. And this has a scallop pattern of development of good behavior. Now variable interval. Variable interval is at different times of, you cannot really predict when you get the reward. So the first response after a variable time. So each response is obtained after variable timing. So this develops a steady behavior. So they know only if they do well, they'll get it. They're under observation. This gives a steady and stable outcome. Now coming on to continuous reinforcement or continuous rewarding. This has a very fast extension rate, because they keep getting it. So they don't tend to work for it or take an effort for it. Okay, this helps in fast learning, but again, it's fast extension also. Okay. So variable ratio schedules, like we discussed, gives the highest behavior development. That is in case of gambling, and with the type of reinforcement schedule which is most prone to extinction is the continuous type. Now coming on to other learning concepts. So here we have social learning. Social learning, as all of you must have known about the Bandura experiment, this mainly states that these behaviors, the learning, certain behaviors of the people are obtained from social learning. They observe and they look at the outcome, and then they incorporate it into themselves. So this is like modeling. Modeling is you model certain people in your life or you see in the media. So that's the social learning. So all of you must be familiar with the Bobo doll experiment. So when children watch adults box the Bobo doll, sometimes they get appreciated, or they tend to repeat these behaviors. So they tend to learn or incorporate this behavior based on what they see in the adults. So if they get rewarded or it's just let off, they tend to continue the aggressive behavior. The children develop this aggressive behavior. But in contrary, if they are punished for the aggressive behavior, the children are aware, okay, this will happen if I do this. So this is something called observational learning. So basically they have a principle that is, it has a cognitive component. It has so the cognitive component involves cognitive dissonance. So now the other learning concept is under cognitive theories are cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is when, so let's discuss about consonance. The opposite of consonance is dissonance. Consonance is when cognitions are consistent with each other, while dissonance is when cognitions conflict each other, creating a psychological conflict or discomfort. So some of the ways this was described by Festinger, and so some of the ways to reduce. So suppose you look at smoking. So when you see the advertisement, okay, it is something bad, it causes cancer, you have that idea. But you tend to have certain theories in your mind, how like you don't want to quit it because everyone is doing it. You tend to say that, okay, my grandfather was also smoking. So you try to rationalize it in your mind. So this is how you deal with cognitive dissonance. So again, based on the patient's inner needs, they alter the cognitive ideas. Then coming to Premack principle. So Premack principle is a grandmother's principle. Like they tend to increase healthy behavior by giving rewards. So when they tend to tell them, you do something which they're not happy to do all the time. Like if you study, I will give you chocolates. So enhancing or increasing the number or the frequency of good behavior by giving rewards. Okay. So helplessness. So helplessness, as all of you know, it is by Seligman. When there's an experiment where the animal tries to escape multiple times and they tend to lose hope and they just curl in and stay there. So this is one of the models of depression. So that's one theory, and this is also coming under learning concepts. Now some of the questions based on what we discussed now. Which reinforcement schedule produces the highest and most extinction resistant response rate? Which is most extinction resistant, does not get extinct at a easy rate. That is variable ratio. So yeah, like we discussed, variable ratio is when you get alarming amounts of money at different point of times. So different ratios are obtained, different ratios of rewards are obtained here. Okay. So that is doesn't get extinct. So it keeps going on and it gets addictive. Okay. Now the second question is removing an unpleasant stimulus to increase the behavior. So here you can look at the clues here. Unpleasant stimulus to increase the behavior. So increase the behavior, we had learned it is reinforcement. Reduce the behavior is punishment. So we know it is reinforcement and it's supposed to be a stimulus which is removed. So it is negative reinforcement. Okay. Removing an aversive stimulus strengthens behavior. It increases, but that does not decrease the response. Okay. Yeah, another clinical scenario, a person keeps using a slot machine despite rarely winning and finds it very hard to stop. So this is a variable ratio to gambling. Okay. Now coming on to the next topic, that is motivation or Maslow's hierarchy. This is the Maslow's hierarchy pyramid, and here on the base, it is physiological needs, safety needs, love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. So the concept is that human motivation is driven by the fulfillment of needs arranged in a hierarchy. So only if these from below, if it is met, they tend to consider the above needs. So physiological needs is the food, water, air, sleep, shelter. Example, hungry person is primarily motivated to get food rather than getting loved or getting higher in the society and other higher self-actualization. So safety needs, again, if they feel safe, only they will go on to the other things. That is financial security, physical safety, safe environment, health. And then only they will go on to the next, like getting love and belonging to someone. Okay, so once they are having a secure relationship, they tend to think about the next level, that is getting esteem needs, self-esteem, confidence, achievement, goal setting, and all that. And so then self-actualization, that is about personal growth and getting creative, following your passion, all that, because other things are all safe and secure and you've obtained it. So the apex on top is self-actualization. So deficiency needs versus growth needs. So this means that when you are deficient of certain needs, this helps you to grow in a faster way. So based on which part of the hierarchy is met. Okay. So that's the point here. Lower, that is the lower part. Deficiency needs must be largely met before the higher ones are obtained. Okay. Now coming on to arousal theory. So these are all about motivation. This is connected to that. So based on the arousal, it helps you get motivated. That's the just the simple explanation here. So let's move on to that. That is about the Yerkes-Dodson law. Here it was proposed by Yerkes and John Dillingham, and it states that performance is best at a moderate level of arousal. So this is the chart here, the inverted U chart, and it shows it is charted on based on performance and arousal. So when there's a moderate amount, that is the optimal peak at the peak, that is an optimal arousal. It gives you the best performance, the highest performance is seen. While when there's low arousal, right here at the bottom, at the left side, it gives it has low arousal and low performance. And the right opposite side, that is high arousal, again gives you low performance. So based on that, we can see on this chart. So when there's high arousal, you get anxious and you're all hyped up, and you cannot concentrate, you cannot focus, so you get low performance. While here on the other end, you are completely low energetic, low initiative, lack of any emotions, you don't perform well. So this is an inverted U, and about the Yerkes-Dodson chart here. Okay, so again, this is something we should know, some points here. Okay. Now coming on to here again, optimal performance occurs at a moderate arousal level. Complex charts are disrupted at low arousal levels than simple ones. So coming on to perception and attention. Here we have to know about how each thing is perceived and how it is taken, as if it is perceived in bit by bit, or is it perceived in a wholesome. Based on that, it is divided. So we have Gestalt principle, proximity, similarity, and closure is other headings here. And based on that, we have figure ground, good continuation, and mostly the whole concept is looked than the small parts of it. Okay. And attention, again, it has selective. That is, there's a lot of things going on, and you select only what you need. Only that is attended to. That is cocktail party effect. Then there's a lot of music playing around. Based on that, it's described here. So here we have again, next we have Broadbent filter, the next model. Here what happens is this is an early selection model of attention. Here, based on the physical appearance or just the when you look at it at once, you feel okay, this is fine, and you attend only to that, and the other informations are blocked, or the other things around are completely blocked. So there's an early selection here. You don't tend to look into it, take some time, and then decide whether you want to focus on this. So early selection, that is filtering, occurs before meaning of the message is analyzed. This is Broadbent filter. While in case of Treisman filter, the other things are just attenuated, or it is given less importance, while the main component is observed and it is taken in and it is analyzed more. But the other things are there. If you give a stimulus, or you tend to get some stimulus from somewhere that you have to attend to this also, you can look into that also. So these are type of the two attention theories, Broadbent and Treisman. Now coming on to divided attention. So divided attention explains how people can attend to more than one task at the same time. You can give attention to different tasks or different topics. So provided that the task does not exceed a certain potential of the person. Now coming on to theories of memory, theories about memory. So based on the storage, it is divided into sensory, short-term and long-term. Sensory is very short based on the sensory system, which sensory system perceives it. So we have about, that is the shortest. Then comes short-term. Now short-term memory is when it has happened recently, a few hours ago or the previous day. So it is slightly longer than sensory memory. So this memory, again sensory memory, based on the modality. If it is a visual, sound is echoic, again visual, or echoic or auditory. So this, based on the type, it is kept in the mind. If more stimuli come in, it is replaced and it is displaced, and you don't tend to completely remember it. That is the shortest memory. Then you have short-term. Short-term's capacity is usually 7 plus or minus 2 items. So again, your digit span test comes here when you test to the patients. Then you have the long-term memory. So the consolidation or repetition or rehearsals tend to transfer it into the long-term memory, and it is there. And the duration of long-term memory is indefinite. Okay. And coming on to working memory. Working memory allows cognitive processes when in the short-term memory data. So like calculation, you do some mental maths, and that's working memory. Or you memorize a number, you memorize your OTP and you put it onto the other screen. This is sort of working memory. So working memory has two components, that is the central executive arms, and it has central executive 2 arms, that is phonological, sound and visuospatial. So you have this working inside with the data available. So maybe mental maths or any sort of mental working that you do. Okay. So this helps in executive functioning, decision making. This was developed by Baddeley. Now about long-term memory, they have different types. There is again, like I mentioned before, it has unlimited and indefinite duration of storage, and the coding is usually semantic through visual, acoustic coding can occur. Okay, and rehearsal helps to keep it there. Okay, so different types are episodic, which you can remember certain episodes in your life, particular instant or incident. It's there in your mind. And again, semantic is general information, names and things like that. And procedural is a type of memory which you remember all the way long, like driving or swimming and things like that. Again, it is divided in another way, that is declarative. You have non-declarative memory. Declarative includes explicit, that is semantic and episodic, while non-declarative is procedural memory. So you can remember these points, it can come for your MCQs. So coming on to the next, you have certain effects on memory. So primacy and recency, that is based on the serial position of the content. So you listen to a list of vegetables that you have to buy, someone is telling you, and you tend to remember the first one and the last one easily, because that if you remember the first one, that's called primacy. You heard it first. You heard it in the beginning. While you can also remember the last one, that is recency. You heard it the last. You just heard it right now, so you remember it. So that's called primacy and recency. That is based on the serial position. Again, primacy and recency will be affected based on types of amnesias. In anterograde amnesia, there is the recency is affected. Okay, Then you have flashbulb memory. So flashbulb memory is vivid emotional memories where you had a lot of emotional experience. Maybe you cried, or you got angry, or you laughed a lot, and you were with somebody you could connect with, or a group of people that you were happy with. So this is called flashbulb memory. It could be a tragic experience also, that you can remember all the emotions and the physiological feelings there. Now, coming on to some of the failure theory, that is, memory failure occurs here. So this misinformation here is something which is used in forensic side, that is the misinformation effect by Loftus. So here, based on some certain questions, the question pattern, people tend to remember in a different way, but maybe that's not actually what happened. So the lawyers or the police, when they question these people for the eyewitness, so this is some example that you can remember. So this was proposed by Elizabeth Loftus, demonstrates that reconstructive rather than a perfect recording of events. So they tend to reconstruct it in their minds. Maybe it's not actually what happened. So that's why in certain cases, not in certain cases, all the cases, you're not supposed to ask the patient too many questions before the police comes and talks to them, because they tend to keep reconstructing it each time you ask them. Each question is asked, so they tend to think in a different way. So this misinformation effect is the distortion of an eyewitness's memory caused by misleading information presented after the event. Memory can be influenced by leading questions, media reports, discussion with other witnesses, suggestion from investigators, etc. So it's very important to remember this misinformation effect by Elizabeth Loftus. Now, confabulation is talking irrelevantly. When you ask one question, they tend to talk something else. It is seen in Wernicke's and Korsakoff psychosis. And again, false memories obtained here. They don't tell you the correct answer for no reason. Okay, lying is different and confabulation is different. There is no motive here. They're not able to recall. So they just fill in the blanks, fill in the empty spaces by giving some random answers. So eyewitness memory is reconstructive and prone to misinformation effect. That is by leading questions. Now, some of the questions here. The Yerkes-Dodson law states that performance is best at the middle peak. So that is moderate arousal. The second one is distortion of eyewitness recall by leading question is the misinformation effect. Primacy effect is about the serial position of the memory, summarizing. Then you have misinformation. Halo effect is, again, we'll be discussing it later. Then flashbulb effect, recency effect. So you can just omit these options here. So performance, moderate arousal, inverted U at the top, the peak of the bell. And this is misinformation effect. Now coming on to social influence theories. So here conformity is a process where no explicit requirement is made to do certain task, but peer influences plays a big role here. Even though you don't like what you're supposed to do, you tend to do it because people around you or a group of people is doing that way. Okay, and smaller the group, more the influence. So if it's a huge group, if it's a group of 100 and you compare it with a group of say 25, the 25 group tends to have this effect more than the larger group. Okay, so then we have certain informational and normative. This also depends on the particular type of information. They want to maintain the normalcy in that group, so they tend to do it that way, what the group does. So it is more very much peer influenced. Okay, and next we have obedience. So obedience is also something which you give an instruction and that is expected to be obeyed. But in case of conformity, it's just done, it's just there, and people tend to follow it. So no particular instruction is given. Okay, so again, coming on to compliance. So here Milligram's theory is when it was a particular authoritative faculty was chosen from a university, and they had to select certain students to give shock therapy or shock to certain objects. So most of them gave high shocks. So they were thinking, okay, I'm expected to give a bad, like a high level of shock to this object, because that faculty who appointed them was a very authoritative person and the most strict professor there. So they tend to obey his type of authoritativeness. Okay. So then we have compliance. So here, these are some group processes which are observed. Compliance. This is another sort of group process that is observed. So here what happens is, so responding favorably to a request. So that is compliance. And it can be both implicit or explicit type. And it is a change of behavior rather than change in attitude. So even though you believe that this is not the actual way it should be done, you tend to follow the group performance here. So foot in the door technique. If one agrees to a small request, this increases likelihood of saying yes again. And door in the face technique is concession effect. Here, when a large request is turned down initially, this increases the likelihood of agreeing to a smaller subsequent request. This most of us, we do in our life. So when a large thing is given and that is denied, you tend to agree to the smaller request here. While foot in the door is when you agree a smaller thing itself, they tend to agree to other following requests. So they slowly allow you inside, the foot in the door. You first start with the small steps and you tend to get in. While door in the face is, okay, the huge thing is shown to you and you don't want it. And then they show a smaller version or a smaller request and you tend to take it up. Okay. So here Milgram showed ordinary people obey destructive instructions from a legitimate authority. So this is obedience. It is not aggression. So in that Milgram experiment, they were not actually angry at the object that they had to shock all the time. They were just following that legitimate authoritative figure. Okay. Now some more group processes that will be discussed today are bystander effect. Here bystander effect is basically bystander apathy. So here what it describes is, if a person is in need of help and there is only one or two people, you tend to feel responsible and you just help them right away. While if it's a group of 100 and one person falls ill, they keep thinking, okay, he might do or she might do it. Why should I do? They're not doing. So that kind of a idea comes up. So that's called bystander effect. So more bystanders, less help is expected. Now, this is also known as Genovese effect. This is one more other name of it. Now again, group thinking. Group thinking happens when, again, poor decisions for consensus. So consensus is when a group is there. So it is usually poor decisions are made when a lot of people are present in the group. Okay. And some theories are social loafing. So social loafing is also known as Ringelmann's effect. It is seen in games such as tug of war and clapping hands after a performance. The larger the group is, the less individual performance, as one thinks the others will do it. Okay, so they tend to happen in groups again, this social loafing. So larger the group, the less individual performance is seen here. So now coming on to de-individualization, that is loss of self in crowd. So you don't find yourself, or you're not appreciated, or you're not seen as an individual in a crowd. You tend to be more free or more comfortable. Sometimes that happens. Or the other way around, you feel left out. So this is de-individualization. Now coming on to this risky shift or polarization. Here again, they tend to move to the certain polarizing. You tend to move to that pole, or just to remember, you tend to move to that extreme because the whole group is following that. Even though it is risky, you tend to move into that position or that part of the idea. Now coming on to some of the named psychological effects. So here you must have heard, most of you, Pygmalion, Hawthorne effect, halo or horn effect, just world effect, fundamental effect, fundamental attribution error, and self-serving bias. So Pygmalion is basically expectations tend to improve performance. So here it follows a self-fulfilling prophecy where students with poor expectations from their teachers internalize and they tend to not perform well anyways. Nobody's expecting anything from me, so I'll just be this way. That's one possibility. And if you have, the teachers have a good expectation, oh my god, they are expecting me to get these many marks, so I have to perform. So this also tends to improve. So based on what your group is, or what the influencing person is, it decides the outcome. Now coming on to Hawthorne effect. This refers to a short-term improvement caused by observing. So when you're doing something and someone's really looking at you, like when you're writing an exam, or you're doing a project, or you're doing some modeling, clay art or something like that, and the trainer or the teacher observes you, comes there and stands next to you, you tend to do your best. That is Hawthorne effect. Behavior changes when observed. Now halo effect is basically when you see one behavior and you judge the person all along. So halo effect is the tendency to perceive other persons as wholly good or bad based on very few observed traits. Okay. Now coming on to just world hypothesis. So believe that people get what they deserve. So this is all. This is why it is. This is because of the world or whatever. It's left onto the world. It's blamed on the world. So refers to the idea that I am just a person living in this world. Everyone here gets what they really deserve. It's not what actually because I'm working for it, or I didn't do something and that's why I just got this much. If I would have done better, I would have gotten better. That's not the theory here. It's because this is what my fate is. They also believe that bad things happen to bad people, leading to blaming the victim culture. So they tend to blame that culture because their generation was like this, or their forefathers were like this. So that's the world. It's based on the world. Now, fundamental attribution error or correspondence bias. This is over-attributing others' acts to the character. So here this refers to overestimating dispositional factors and not situational factors, while attributing causes for others' behavior. This allows a sense of predictability to be developed about the other person. It is more pronounced if the attributed behavior is negative and undesirable. So this happens mostly when the behavior is undesirable or it's a negative behavior. This tends to be the attribution error. It is because of, not because of the situation, it's because of their problem. The dispositional factors are given more importance than the situational factors. Now coming on to self-serving bias. The actor-observer effect is most pronounced when judging negative behaviors. This may be absent or reversed for positive behaviors. And hence, such self-serving bias offers self-enhancement and defense. So this happens like when there's credit success, there's no much of a problem, blaming, or there's no reasoning much. They don't blame the circumstance, or they don't tend to say, okay, this was because of it. But when it happens in a bad way, they tend to blame the circumstance. So fundamental attribution error, this is when we explain others' behavior by disposition, but our own by the situation. Okay. So they are bad because of their behavior, and something bad happened to me because of the situation. This is a fundamental attribution error in its simple words. So attribution and attitudes. So coming on to attribution and attitudes, we have the internal factors versus external factors. Then we have stable versus unstable factors and Kelly's covariation model. Here what happens is attribution is a process by which we make judgments where it's attributed to certain factors, internal, external, stable, unstable factors, and so we tend to attribute these events, and it co-varies between those behaviors. So if if suppose A is an event that occurs when, and B is the behavior that is observed because of that particular event, then we often assume that the A, that is the event, that incident that happened, and the behavior model. So next we have so then we have certain dimensions for this attributions. We have the, like I mentioned here, we have based on the locus. It is internal or external. Internal is because of my problem this happened. While external locus of control is because the society is bad or the economy. It could be transient, it could be stable or unstable based on certain factors. And next we have biases. So here fundamental attribution error again happens here because of certain based on something bad happened to me because of the situation, while something bad happened to them because of their problem. So it's biased here. That thinking is biased based on what happens to you and others. Again, actor-observer difference. They tend to contradict. Now, attitude change. Again, we had discussed about cognitive dissonance. Only the attitude is changed, but the actual thought is not changed. So we have that conflict because of why this is a problem, but I want to keep doing it. That is cognitive dissonance. So this is dealt in different ways by rationalizing in different ways. So that's about attribution. Then coming on to attitudes, components and formation. So we have a few models here about attitude. We have the 3-component or tripartite component. It has affective, that is feelings, behavior, that is action, and cognition, that is beliefs. And it is formed, again, we have discussed about classical operant condition and modeling. Then we have attitude behavior gap is something we should be knowing. That attitudes is not the actual behavior. If you have a certain thought, you tend to keep it, but based on the attitude and the thought, the behavior occurs. So attitude does not equal to the behavior. And specificity and context matters what kind of attitude and behavior comes out. Attitudes have 3 components: affective, ABC, affective, behavioral, and cognitive. While Lapierre stated that attitudes often diverge from actual behavior. So they don't really converge and go in a straight line. They diverge and go in opposite directions. Now coming on to attitude change. So what happens here is, again, we've discussed about consistency, persuasion routes, and Yale model. So what happens here is consistency. This helps. This is based on how repeatedly this happens. So cognitive dissonance again applies here. Then there's a balance theory and self-perception theory. Balance theory is by Haider. Self-perception theory is by Bem. So you have three models here: consistency, persuasion routes, and Yale model. Now coming on to persuasion routes, there's an elaboration likelihood. That is Pitti and Cacioppo, while central type is the peripheral, central versus peripheral route is also there here. Then we have Yale model. That is a Hovland theory. Here what happens is the source, message, and audience is considered, and this affects the credibility and fear appeals. The elaboration likelihood model contrasts a central route, careful processing of argument, with a peripheral route, cues like source attractiveness. Now, some of the measurement scales for measuring attitudes is Likert scale. Here, agree, disagree, across statements. This is measured. Thurstone. Here, equal appearing intervals. This is what is observed. And semantic differential. Semantic differential is based on bipolar adjective ratings by Osgood. And Bogardus, again, social distance is assessed. And Gutman, here it is cumulative and unidimensional. Okay, so Likert scale, that is the summated agree-disagree items are presented and is the commonest attitude measure. The semantic differential uses bipolar adjective pairs. Some of the questions. The reduced likelihood of helping when others are present is the bystander effect. While Milgram's experiments primarily demonstrated obedience to authority. So here participants delivered dangerous shocks, which they wouldn't have done based on their behavior or their thought pattern, but only because it was influenced by an authoritative figure who was very strict. They did it in his pattern. Quick scenario. On a crowded train, a man collapses. Many passengers notice but assume someone else will act, and no one ends up helping that person. Bystander effect via diffusion of responsibilities. The more witnesses present, the less likely any individual intervenes. Coming on to stigma and labeling, most of you must be familiar with these terms. So types of stigma: public, self and structural stigma. Goffman introduced the term spoiled identity. So he also described moral career of mentally ill patient. That is the process whereby a person with social ties, friends and family in the community is institutionalized and converted into an inmate whose world is limited to that hospital ambience. And again, labeling by Sheff and Rosenhin. Labels shape role. So giving you a label or a thing that you're a schizophrenic or you're insane, it shapes their whole action or their role in life, or they tend to behave in different ways. And social mechanisms: social causation versus social drift. So social causation is that it is caused by social problems or factors, while social drift is when you get away from the society, you tend to get sick or you go into psychosis. This is one theory. This is the theory. Social drift: illness causes downward social mobility, social causation. Adversity contributes to illness, both in schizophrenics. Now coming to culture and psychiatry. Cultural formulation. Here, DSM-5 cultural formulation interview it is idioms of distress. While in ethnicity and diagnosis, overdiagnosis of schizophrenia can occur, and sometimes in some minority groups. And that is, in certain minority groups, they tend to overdiagnose schizophrenia. Now, some of the concepts of culture and psychiatry: emic versus etic perspectives. So here, emic perspective means it used to refer to perspective of an individual from a specific cultural group about his own group, while etic perspective refers to the perspective of an individual outside a specific cultural group about the study group. The etic approach is, for instance, involves applying Western psychiatric concept en bloc into a different culture and uses it for diagnosis. Then other concepts are multiculturalism and acculturation. Some of the social determinants. So here, there are some life events which affects attitude or thinking or behavior or the psychiatric illness. So Brown and Harris proposed this. So due to loss of events, so these are the life events which can influence a person and they go into depression. These are the vulnerability factors. Now about express emotion. This is very important in case of schizophrenia. So these are proven to increase the amount of reduce the remission or recovery of schizophrenia. So these have to be observed and counseled about for the family members. So when there is high expressed emotion, they tend to reduce the recovery or enhance the relapses here. So we have expressed emotions. Examples are criticism, over-involvement, or avoidance, neglection. Okay. Now, based on social status, certain social classes and health gradient also plays a role here. And again, sick role, assisting or nurturing sick role tends to keep them in that disorder state rather than getting better and getting it resolved. So when there's high expressed emotion like criticism, hostility, over-involvement in family, they predict a relapse in schizophrenia or they cause a barrier for improvement. Some of the questions: high expressed emotion in a family is most associated with a relapse in schizophrenia, while drift of people with severe mental illness into lower social classes describes social drift. A clinical scenario here is a young man with schizophrenia relapses repeatedly after discharge to a household where relatives are highly critical and over-involved. They tend to, over-criticalism. They keep commenting or they keep saying, oh, you're having this problem, you're taking medications, you have to be careful. And they tend to help them in every single way. They don't encourage independence or making the patient do things on their own. They always interrupt their improvement. So that's why it does not help them to recover. So high expressed emotion is a strong predictor of relapse of schizophrenia. Family psychoeducation helps in reducing expressed emotions. Now coming on to the next section here that we have is personality. So theories of personality. This is something we'll have to know. So we just need to know the types of personality theories. So we have trait personality theories. Eysenck's, that is psychoticism, extraversion and neuroticism. Somehow we'll have to memorize this. Eysenck's theory of personality. And based on biological basis, it involves neuroticism, means the neurotic symptoms that is observed. Then we have the five-factor theory. This involves 5 factors. That is ocean, openness, consciousness. Then you have extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And others are Cahill, which has 16 personality factors, and type A and type B. That is, type A is more prone to cardiac risk. This is a very old theory, and type B is more relaxed and less possibility of cardiac risk. The personality assessment is by certain battery of tests that we have. There are 3 types. Objective, which is the person itself reports it. So these are self-applied scales. So we have MMPI, self-report inventory, and validity scales are built in itself there. Then we have projective type of tests, that is giving images and asking them to interpret it. So we have Rorschach inkblot tests. You have, in this itself, you have black and white and colorful. And based on what they interpret, there are common responses, there are rare responses, and based on that interpretation, the psychologist gives a report. And then we have TAT, thematic age perception test. A scenario is given, and the patient is asked to tell a story. What happened right before this scene, and what is happening, and what happens after the scene. Okay, these tend to have low reliability, but it helps give you a better picture when there is a diagnostic for a diagnostic clarification. Then some of the other approaches are nomothetic, that is traits across people, and idiographic is about the individual. Now coming on to trait models comparison. So we have Eysenck. This is psychoticism, extraversion, neuroticism. While you have 5 factors, all these openness, consciousness, extraversion, again I can show it to you. Openness, consciousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Then we have Cahill, which is 16 personality factors, type A, type B. Eysenck's and Big 5 models overlap on extraversion and neuroticism. Big 5 adds in these other 3 components: openness, agreeableness, and consciousness. So it's important to remember at least these to identify or differentiate among in your MCQs or EMIs. Now coming on to theories of intelligence. So here there's a structure. Based on structure of the theories or the intelligence is divided into Spearman's theory, where general factors are considered. And we have Cahill's theory, where fluid or crystallized information is assessed. There are general factors and specific factors. So individual differences mainly depend on the general factors. So a person is considered bright, for example. Intelligence is a sum of general factors and specific factors. So it is not only general factors that describe the structure. It also involves the specific factors of the patient's intelligence. Now coming on to some measurements here, you can remember this formula here. So IQ is measured as mental age divided by chronological age into 100. Then we have Flynn's effect, rising IQ scores over generations, mainly due to environmental influences. Now, some of the one important point: fluid intelligence, that is, problem solving declines with age, and crystallized intelligence is preserved or rises. That is the theory of Cattell. So now we have factor theories. Spearman's, that is general, like I mentioned before. Thurston, primary mental abilities are measured, and Cattell, fluid versus crystallized. Multiple or triarchic, we have Gardner, which involves multiple intelligences are observed or studied here, and Sternbach, in which three components, that is analytical, creative, and practical domains are studied. Then we have based on structure. So Guilford, that is structure of the intellect, or Vernon, which is a hierarchical model. So it's important to remember these terms and what it actually is actually explained, how you explain it. So Spearman, Thurston, Cattell are the factor theory. Based on what kind of factors of intelligence are considered, it is divided. Then based on multiple and triarchic theories, that is Gardner and Sternberg. While based on structure of intelligence, you have Guilford and Vernon. Again, based on the structure of intellect, again hierarchy of the intellectual information. So Spearman proposed general factor, Cattell split it into fluid and crystallized intelligence. Some of the tests. So it's important to know these tests, at least what it stands for and when it is used. So you have WAIS. WAIS is Wechsler's Adult Intelligence Scale. Adult Wechsler scale with a mean of 100 and standard deviation of 15. We have Wisconsin's test here, WISC test. We have WPPSI. This is mainly for children. So this is Wechsler's Intelligence Scale for children, while WAIS is Wechsler's Adult Intelligence Scale. Then we have Stanford Binet. Then we have again another test is Binet-Carmeth, and we have Revan's matrices and British Ability Scales. So basically, it's the most commonly and most accepted ones are WAIS or Wechsler's scale for adults and children, and we have Stanford Binet, and also Raven's matrices are used. Then we have Seguin-Form Board test. This was very old. Mostly used in children, like maybe below 10 years. Seguin-Form Board test, which has these are all wooden boxes with lots of parts, which helps to assess the intelligence. So Raven's progressive matrices is a non-verbal, relatively culture-fair test of fluid intelligence. The NART estimates pre-morbid IQ. So NART is an important measure where you can assess the pre-morbid IQ. This is in case of organic problems like organic amnesias or after a traumatic brain injury. It is important to know the pre-morbid IQ. Now coming on to some of the questions here. Which intelligence type is best preserved with aging? So we had discussed this before. So fluid intelligence is usually what we tend to keep developing with age also it keeps, while crystallized intelligence is preserved well with aging. Okay. And Rorschach in-plot test is an example of, it is not objective. Objective is where you answer the questions. Projective is again you're given an object and you're given a certain ambiguous image or stimuli, and you're asked to interpret it. That is projective personality test. So ambiguous stimuli are interpreted to reveal personality. Projective tests have limited reliability. It can vary. It's not necessary it is true, but it's important, and only with a lot of experience only one can conduct these tests. Now coming on to ethical theories. So these are very important. It can definitely come for your exams, MCQs. So it's important to go back and learn about it. So you have Beauchamp and Childress, which explains about autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. These are the 4 principles about Beauchamp and Childress theories. Then you have major theories, deontology based on duty, and consequentialism based on the outcomes. This is utilitarian model. And you have virtue ethics. It's based on character. And here again, some of the points here is case-based, and principalism is in practice. Your deontology judges acts by duty roles. So based on the duty, the ethical theory is divided here. And you have consequentialism, judges by the outcomes. Okay. So this is commonly asked single best answer question here. Now some of the, there's a research ethics based on what was not done in the past and now it is observed to be done. Nuremberg Code here, voluntary consent is mandatory. That's when it came into action. And Declaration of Helsinki, here there were experiments conducted on humans without any consent. So based on that incidence, these Declaration of Helsinki developed. And duty to warn. So Tarasov rule is when a third party is involved, or when suppose a boyfriend is your client and the boyfriend says that I'm going to kill her or poison my girlfriend because I'm sure she's cheating on me. Maybe it's a delusion disorder, and you have a duty there, and you can breach confidentiality and inform the concerned person because it's a serious threat. Now, other one is based on standard of care. So Bolam, responsible body of opinion. So it is considered here, and Bolito means it should be logical. Now, key flag. Here, Tarasov established a duty to protect identifiable third parties from patients' serious threats. Confidentiality is not absolute here when there's a threat. Now, again, these are some of the terms which you are familiar about. We have consent, capacity, confidentiality. So consent is again informed, voluntary, and capacitous. Here it is informed consent is when you have to take a consent from a patient in order to start treatment or do a procedure. It should be specific to the intervention. So all the basic information should be provided. The patient should be in a state that they can understand the explanation, or maybe you should wait for a lucid interval period of time. In case the patient is not fit to give consent and something has to be done at the earliest, a best interest meeting is conducted. So here the doctor, the concerned team members, the treatment team members make a discussion and think about the best interest of in the best interest of the patient. And also the person concerned will be involved, the person who has been administered as a person to take decisions, which has been appointed by the patient. So this person also attends the best interest committee meeting. And then we have capacity. Here, based on certain factors, the capacity of the patient is decided, whether he or she has the capacity to decide or understand the situation and make decisions about the treatment or the procedure. So if they are able to understand, if they're able to retain the information, weigh the benefits and risks, and communicate it to the concerned team member or the treating team. Okay, so this should be decision has to be made at particular time, that particular time. If not, if they lack the capacity, then again a best interest team is conducted. Now, breaching confidentiality. Here again, based on the risk, if there's risk to self or others, or there's a public problem at possibility here, there's a possibility of breaching confidentiality. Okay, there should be a proportionate disclosure. Now, based on these points, we have certain questions. Judging the rightness of an act solely by its consequences. So that is consequentialism. Based on the duty, it's deontology. Okay, and then you have the legal duty to protect an identifiable third party from a patient's threat derives from Bolam, Tarasov, Nuremberg, Gillick, Bonewood. Again, we all know Tarasov. Consequentialist or a utilitarian model ethics evaluates actions by their outcomes. So based on the outcomes, possible outcomes, the ethics of that is evaluated. So deontology focuses on the duties. what sort of duty was supposed to be done. Then you have Tarasov rule. This is created to protect identifiable third parties, and it does not have complete confidentiality here. It can be breached. Now, a clinical scenario here. A patient tells you in detail that he tends to seriously harm a named ex-partner, and you judged the threat as credible. And there's high chances that they might do it, and there is no way that you will be able to send him and get him admitted on time, so that this possible threat is avoided. So this is when the first thing you should do is to inform the third party. So duty to protect, or Tarasov principle. Confidentiality may be breached proportionately to warn or protect the identifiable person. Again, proportionally is very important. Now, coming to models of mental illness, we have an integrative model. Here, a biopsychosocial, or that means biological, psychological, and social factors are considered in order to understand whether the patient is ill or mentally ill, or they won't be able to perform certain things. That is Engel's model of biopsychosocial approach. This is used in etiological formulations in psychiatric practice, highlighting the prominence of social factors in the practice of psychiatry. So when you talk to a patient, you look at the biological factors or biological domains that are affected, then the psychological part which is affected, also the social picture there, if they're functioning or they're interacting, or they are again socially drifted. Okay, then you have diathesis stress model. This is based on vulnerability and stress. So the more vulnerable, they are more prone to stress, and they tend to break out. Now we have critical approach here. This is again anti-psychiatry. That is, the mental illness is a myth. It is not something which is there actually. It's just a myth. Then we have Laning, in which social context of psychosis. So the social context of psychosis is considered here in Laning model. And others are medical versus social model and recovery model. So diathesis stress model is important. A biopsychosocial model is also important here. The diathesis stress model is a disorder. This is when a disorder emerges when a predisposing vulnerability factor needs sufficient environmental stress. So already the patient is vulnerable due to stress, and then they tend to fall into depression or by mania or addiction, things like that. Now coming to clinical reasoning and risk. So how it is explained. So you have cognitive basis, that is anchoring availability and confirmation of the information, and base rate neglect. So then you have risk assessment. This is done, very important, has to be done. Clinical risk assessment is done. So high clinical risk assessment of 20. So this is judged, and important decisions are made based on this. Whether they have to be admitted, or this has to be informed, an involuntary admission has to be performed, things like that. Actuarial and versus clinical prediction. Then you have neuropsychological point of view, that is standardized cognitive tests. So based on this, you can get an idea about the patient's status, and then it helps to localize and quantify deficits. So neuropsychology batteries are there, which can help you identify certain deficits, neurocognitive deficits. So structured and actuarial risk tools, that is HCR 20, which is generally outperformed unconsidered. So here you won't miss any point of prediction of risk. So risk assessment is very important. It is a main component in case of your CASP part of your CASP preparation, where you have to assess risk assessment is a station for you. Now some few points that you will have to refer, and it can come for your exams, is history of psychiatry, your moral treatment by Pinel and Tuke, Kreplin's classification, and then you have psychoanalysis by Freud, deinstitutionalization again by Freud. Then you have modern practices, that is evidence-based practice, and service user movement. Some of the questions based on this are: a disorder emerging when an inherited vulnerability meets life stress best fits the Diet is a stress model. Okay. Then you have the second question. Compared with unstructured clinical judgment, actuarial and you use actuarial and structured risk tools are generally more accurate. So we have this. Bystander effect, when more witnesses reduce the chance of helping, is explained by reduced responsibility or diffusion of responsibility. Okay. With more witness present, responsibility to act is shared and diluted. So any individual is less likely to help. Judging an action right or wrong purely by its consequences is called, this ethical theory is called, it's there in the question itself, consequentialism. This is a utilitarian type of theory and focuses on outcomes. Deontology mainly focuses on duties and rules regardless of the outcome. So these are some points here. Never versus always, like this for the behavioral science. Let's confuse negative reinforcement with punishment. These are some of the things that you should never get confused. So what you have is, like I mentioned before, reinforcement helps increase a behavior. Whether it's bad or good, it helps increase the behavior, while punishment helps you decrease the behavior. This itself you can narrow down to a possibility here. And then you look whether it is something is given or something is removed. And that is negative or positive, then you can make a decision there. Treat confidentiality as absolute when others are at serious risk. Then you have over-attribute others' behavior to character. So that is fundamental attribution error. So others' problem occurred because of their behavior, while my problem occurred because of the environmental problem. Then you have assume eyewitness memory. This is again that Loftus rule here of in learning theories we discussed. So based on certain leading questions and certain types or patterns of talking to the person, they tend to alter information on their own even without their knowledge. Okay. Then always link variable ratio schedules to persistent behavior. Okay, variable ratios. Variable ratio, that is, you get a reward in variable ratios. That means like gambling. Each time you get a higher amount, each time you get rewarded. So this tends to keep making you do it. So it is very less prone to extinction, and it tends to keep persisting. It's always there. While constant or continuous rewarding is very much prone to extinction. Apply the Tarasov duty to protect identifiable third parties. Recognize high expressed emotion as a relapse risk. Okay. Use the 4 principle to structure an ethical dilemma. Now some of the important points again in learning and cognition. Highest and most persistent responding is variable ratio. Remove aversive and there is an increased behavior. So you are removing something that is negative and it increases the behavior. It is reinforcement. If it's the other way around, when there is applying or you're putting a stimulus, putting a reward, putting a punishment, putting aversive stimulus, and it reduces the behavior, that becomes putting something is positive. You have positive there, and reducing a behavior, it is punishment. So it is positive punishment. Okay, so that's how you remember and break it down. Now, so observational learning, again, the Bandura-Bogodol experiment based on observational learning. Then you have learned helplessness by Seligman, model of depression. Then optimal arousal, again the inverted bell peak or the inverted U graph, where it is plotted against performance and arousal. And there is the optimal arousal is there, it gives you maximum amount of performance. So moderate or the optimum level of arousal gives you maximum response rate or maximum performance, not response, sorry. So less amount of arousal, there is less initiative or lack of even desire. So performance is very low. While when there's high amount of arousal on the X coordinate, you have lots of anxiety and lots of discomfort, distress. This makes you perform very less, or the potential does not come out here. Then you have eyewitness distortion, or the Loftus effect by Elizabeth. Here, this is the misinformation effect, memory failure. When the memory is not actually problematic, but it is tended to get reconstructed by certain questions or the media's ideas. It influences you a lot. So that's why they keep the witness protected, or the victim protected. They don't ask them anything. The judge or the police or the main person who has to make decision asks them. Otherwise, they're not allowed to question the victim or the witness. Then, in social psychology, there is obedience to authority. So just because that person who appointed you to do a certain task, and you're concerned about how that person is going to think about me if I don't do it in his way or her way, you tend to do it in that way. But actually, inside your mind, your attitude is not what the behavior is, what you're doing. The attitude is different, but the behavior is different because of an influence. So that is obedience to authority, Milgram's experiment. Then conformity to a group. So that is Ash described. When here conformity and obedience is differentiated. Conformity, nobody tells you a structured instruction to do. They just put you in a group and they just observe you in a group. The theory is based on that. So based on what the group does, you tend to do it. And bigger the group, lesser effect of conformity, and you don't have much of an obligation to conform to those the group pattern. But if it's a smaller group, you tend to conform more. And even though your attitude or your ideology about what the group is doing is not in favor of what you actually think, but you tend to do it just to be normal and accepted in the group. So this is conformity to a group. And coming on to more witnesses, less help is bystander effect. Consensus over judgment. Again, here group thinking. Here that's what the consensus applies here. So when there's a group, you tend to think in that way, and you don't really think about what is actually judged or done in the end. Whatever the group thinks, I'm going for that. Just to stay in that group or normalize in that group. Then you have expectation, which causes performance. This is Pygmalion. We had discussed about this. The teachers have high expectations about you, so you tend to take more effort. And the teachers or the parents don't have any expectations from you, like, you're just useless, you can't do it, there's no point in trying. Those comments comes out, you'll be like, what's the point? I can't do it. So it's very difficult to come out of it unless you have a determination. So that is Pygmalion theory. Then you have observation. Observation causes more output, and this Hawthorne effect. Again, similar things here. Phenomenon. Based on phenomenon, you have obedience to authority, Milgram, diffusion of response, bystander effect, expectation effect, Pygmalion or Rosenthal, being observed, Hawthorne effect. One trait colors the judgment. So one thing you see and that's it, you're judging that person. That is halo effect. Then you have based on a theory, and you're asked to pick the author. You have operant conditioning, Skinner. When an instrument or an action is involved, you have to do something, pick up the lever, and you get the food pellet. Then you have cognitive dissonance by Festinger, hierarchy of needs, Maslow, 4 principles, that is Grisham and Childress. Then you have duty to protect, that's Tarasov's rule. Okay, so here this ends our session for today. So please try to memorize these points only at least, and you can see how it goes.